out that there was at least one ghost story, and the rest is history, because people began telling about their encounters with the ghosts, and that got me started looking into the stories, and we even had some experiences ourselves. But that made me start thinking about all the stories from when I was younger that I'd heard, and I began to think about all the stories that had been lost because no one's telling stories anymore, really. And so I decided to try to save what I could and preserve them in a book. And that led to 2 books of my own, one book that I've co-authored with my friend Amy Spees, and we have just started on working on a 4th.
Very awesome. Now, that's sort of a little different than a lot of people. Usually it's a haunting that they experience themselves that kind of get them started. Did you approach this more from being a paranormal investigator or a folklorist?
Well, it started as more of the folklore, trying to preserve the stories. But as it progressed, and we began looking more into the stories and the history behind them and experiencing things ourselves, it transformed into an investigation type deal. Amy and I have a group called Camel City Spirit Seekers based out of Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And we have been around the state doing investigations and presenting programs on North Carolina ghosts. So I have had experiences. In fact, when I was 13, I remember seeing my grandpa a few days after he passed away. And that was a deeply personal experience, and I don't really talk much about that because it was so personal. But I guess you could call that my first paranormal experience.
Well, I certainly understand. I know I grew up in a house that had activity, and that was my initial interest, and then kind of came back to it much later too. But you kind of got me thinking. As investigators, we get so busy in trying to document evidence and talk about the validity of evidence and truth and reality that we can kind of forget sort of the much longer human tradition of folklore and mythology. That what do you think the value of folklore is today versus science validation?
Well, science is a really good tool, but it's not the be-all, end-all. We use scientific equipment and we use scientific methods when we're doing the investigations, but we also rely on our instincts and our feelings. And a lot of times, science will fail you where your feelings won't, and vice versa. I tend to be I believe in a spirituality and a personal relationship with my God, as far as my personal beliefs. That we have several different belief systems in our group. But yeah, I use science as a tool, and that's it.
I think I agree. I think in our quest, we all have that quest that we want something that's objective and verifiable, that kind of passes that muster of the scientific method. And sometimes it's easy to reject everything else as superstition, I guess.
Sure.
And forget that that there is a very valid role for folklore and storytelling independent of anything else. What do you think will happen as far as the role of storytelling and folklore as technology progresses?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. You faded out on me.
Okay, let me try this again. What do you think the role of folklore and story is going to, how it's going to change with progression of technology?
Well, I don't know. I hope storytelling doesn't die out, because that would be a real shame. I think maybe with the CDs and everything and the podcasts on the internet, maybe storytellers will get to the point of where they're recording their stories more than actually going out in groups and telling them. But I enjoy doing that. I like to have an audience, and I can sit there and I relate these stories. And they always seem to have fun with it. So hopefully that will not die out completely.
Oh, I agree with you. Yeah, you have to get over here. Introduce yourself.
Hey, how's it going?
Here's John.
Hey. How are you, John?
I'm okay. How are you?
I'm not sure
I'm here.
if my camera survived, but...
I'm not sure Sony's going to survive after that. Sony and I are going to have it out.
We were just talking about the fact that Michael kind of came at the field from an angle of preserving stories and folklore, and we were talking about the role of folklore versus science and as technology progresses.
Okay.
Just to catch you up, since you have been off.
I'm actually lost right now.
Okay.
Even after the explanation.
Okay. Well, we'll have to educate him, I guess.
Well, man.
What do you think? Do you think the audiences are changing as far as are they less receptive to storytelling than they used to be?
Well, I don't know. I think with the advent of all these TV shows like Ghost Hunters and Ghost Lab and Paranormal States, they have been good in the light that they have caused more interest in the field, and they've gotten people more interested in hearing these stories. And places that are haunted are now, in some instances, more open to the idea of people visiting them and looking into their ghost stories than they were, say, 15 years ago when it was taboo to have a ghost. They didn't want to broadcast it. Let's say there was a hotel and they had a haunted room. They would not broadcast that because they were afraid people would not come to their hotel. But now that is kind of a draw if there's a haunted room in a hotel. People are wanting to rent that room to see if something happens there. So I think people are more open to the idea of paranormal activity than they were even 10 years ago.
Oh, I agree with you there. I was reading a story a while back about...
You trying to fly?
No, I think you're trying to knock me off my chair.
Sorry?
John was playing elbows with me here. I read a story not long ago about some travel company promoting booking weddings at haunted locations around the country. So I think, there definitely is more of an interest of seeking out that experience. Do you think that's going to last the TV fad?
Well, right now I think it's a fad, sort of a trend. You know how people get into these trends, but I think it will last because there are going to be certain people who will just continue with this even after the spotlight has diminished, if you understand what I'm saying.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's here to stay. It may not be as big as it is right now, but it's here to stay.
I agree with you, and I think you're able to look at things a lot more openly and kind of get past the taboo issue a lot more than you used to.
Certainly. And at one time, there was this tendency to think of paranormal activity as demonic all the time. If there was something like that going on, then it had to be a demon. But now people are understanding and more open to the fact that it doesn't necessarily mean there's a demon. It could be simply a human spirit that has not moved on, or it can be residual energy of something that happened years ago.
And I've actually been accused of being a devil worshiper because I do work in the paranormal, which I think is fascinating because I don't even believe in the devil. So, but
I've never been accused of that.
You've never been accused of being a devil worshiper for being in the paranormal?
Yep. No, that's never happened to me. But then again, most people know, and I'm pretty upfront with it, how I believe that, I believe the Bible. So I've never been accused of that.
Well, I think there's just...
Now, I have been asked.
Uh-huh.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I have been asked before if I thought, that every time something happened, whether I thought it might be a devil or something, but, I always answer no. And I've had people ask me if I've been hurt by something, which I never have been.
Well, and I agree with you there. I think there's just some people who are so close-minded to things that, if you're involved in the field, you must be, somehow evil or devil worshiping or something, and that just gives that to their own personal beliefs. But we do a lot of public Events, and we were at one last night, in fact, and a lot of these similar questions were asked, and we get asked a lot about, how frequent, it's inhuman or demonic, that kind of thing, and
I think people assume it's demonic just because of television. I think that's where they get. Of course, that's probably where they get their information. But
right.
We get asked that quite often.
Hollywood.
Yeah, it's Hollywood.
Yeah, Hollywood is largely responsible for that.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
I mean, negative entities. Okay, yeah, that happens. I mean, not every person that lives in life is a happy person either. So, but I think the majority of them are demonic.
Yeah, I mean, are not demonic.
I don't know, some living people, I'd call them demons.
Just about.
Yeah, there's some pretty evil people out there.
And just because something negative is happening or bad is happening doesn't mean it has to be one of those things. Because people get angry, and people get upset, and people get confused. And a lot of times, if their spirit is confused, perhaps they don't realize they're dead, or they're angry that they're dead, or something happened to them. For some reason, they're angry or confused. They can make what people would consider something bad happen when they're really just trying to communicate.
Well, exactly.
I've seen that happen. Go ahead.
Oh, I agree with you. It's sort of a jerk in life, a jerk in death, so to speak, too.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know that a friend of mine, he had I think she was either a daughter-in-law or a niece-in-law, was killed in an automobile accident. And her spirit, he began encountering that spirit in the house, and she was very angry, and she was very confused. And it took them nearly 6 months to get calmness back in that house, just to get her calmed down where she wasn't just acting out. She most definitely wasn't an evil person. She was actually a quite nice person.
Well, I think if you put yourself in that position, that if of something happening to you so suddenly, probably very violently, without seeing it coming, that, I mean, most people would be confused. I mean, be like, something happening to you very suddenly, waking up in the hospital out of a coma months later and not being able to walk. A lot of people are going to be confused and angry. I don't see how it would be any different, really.
Yes.
What are some of the most interesting stories that you've documented that you think are important to keep passing along to the future generations?
Well, I'll give you the stories that got me interested in college were East Residence Hall. And I'll go with the main one of East Residence Hall. There are several in there. There are at least a dozen different ghost stories and a dozen different people who are supposed to be ghosts. But the main one, I'll tell you about it. When I was a freshman in 1987, I worked in East Hall. And people started talking about a ghost. And in September, there were a group of about a dozen boys who were sitting in the hallway on the first floor talking. And there was a young man came walking amongst them, wearing a plaid shirt, jeans, and hiking boots. He had sandy hair, and he walked amongst them, turned, and went to a corner room and shut the door behind him. Well, these boys realized that the young men who lived in that room were not there. They were gone for the weekend. So they went down there and started banging on the door, and there was no light under there. Nobody would answer the door. So one of them went to get the RA. The RA came back. They keyed into the room, and when they went in, the lights were turned off, so they turned them on. The windows were closed and locked from the inside, but the room was empty. There's no one under the beds, no one in the closet. The room was totally empty, and it was cold as ice. And most of the boys had been standing outside the door while the one went to get the RA. So they knew he had never come out. So he just went into the room and vanished. And so,
did they assume it was a living person? Was it that clear?
Yes, they thought it was a living person at first. And of course, when he wasn't in there and the doors were locked and windows were locked from the inside, that caused a buzz in the dormitory. So a few weeks later, East Hall had this thing they called the Dorm of Doom, which was a spook trail that wound through the main lobby of East Hall, along first floor, down a stairwell, and out through the basement. And so they did this every year. The kids would come from all around, college students would come in, and they would have this spook trail. So after it was over with, this was in late October, this young man named James, who was one of the fellows who saw the earlier incident, was in the basement of East Hall by himself. In one of the classrooms, he was gathering his sound equipment together. And he heard the outside doors of the basement slam shut. He said, they just chained those doors. He could be opening. So he looked up, and he saw the same young man that he'd seen upstairs walk right by the doorway. Well, James, he yelled an expletive and dove for the doorway. And he landed on the floor there, and where he landed, he could see the hallway in both directions, down the hall towards a bathroom and the other way towards the steps. Well, the man was gone, but he could still hear the footsteps. And then he heard the stairwell door open and close and someone going up the steps. James left his equipment there and went on upstairs and got it the next morning. But he said it was the exact same guy he had seen go into that room. So that was late October when this happened. That caused another buzz in the dormitory. And between then and now, dozens, maybe even hundreds of people over the years have seen the same young man repeat the same thing, walk into the basement or walk onto that hall and go into that room. In fact, I saw him myself in the fall of 1989. I was working in-house security needs, and I was also living there. And it was about 2 o'clock in the morning. I was on rounds, and I was walking on the subfloor, which it's a below first floor and above the basement. And it's only on one wing of East Hall. But I was on my rounds, and I heard a young lady gasp. And so I hurried up and went on around in the little common area. There was this girl that I knew standing there. Her name was Jennifer, and she had her hand over her mouth, and she was white as a sheet. And I said, Jennifer, what's the matter? And she said, there's a creepy guy on the steps. So I went out to the stairwell, and I saw him going up. And he'd already gotten halfway up the first set of stairs there. I caught a glimpse of his face. And I said, hey. But he didn't hear me, or he didn't act like he heard me. He just kept going. And when he got to the landing, there were doors that went down onto what they called the East Beach, which was an open area in the middle of a sea formed by the building. Well, I took off running up the steps. And by the time he got to the first floor landing, I was only 2 or 3 steps behind him. And he went out onto the first floor, and I was right there, but he was gone. And I stepped up and I looked down both ways of the hall. There was nothing but one of the girls, another girl that I knew. Her name was Dawn. She was on the payphone on the first floor, and she waved at me. So I walked down to where she was, and she hung up, and she said, hey, Michael, how are you? And I said, I'm okay. Dawn, where did that guy go that came out of the stairs in front of me? And she looked confused. She said, huh? I said, the guy that was in front of me, where did he go? And she said, what are you talking about? I said, Dawn, don't mess with me. This guy down just scared Jennifer down on the fifth floor. I need to at least talk to him. Which way did he go? And she turned white and she said, Michael, you're the first person I've seen in 20 minutes. You're the first person that came out of the stairs. And that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. And she said, oh my gosh, you saw him. You saw the ghost. And so things like that happen in East a lot. And we started hearing stories that a young man had killed himself in East and sometime in the past. We began researching that. Sometime in 1990, they found a newspaper, I think it was either the Appalachian or the Ottawa Democrat, that had an article about this young man who had shot himself in East Hall in 1977. It was the first suicide at Appalachian since it had become full university. And so on with that, over the next several years, we researched, and finally, just 2 to 3 years ago, some students found the death certificate for the young man who killed himself in East. His name was Lacey Dean Everett. He was from Greensboro. He was 17, and he shot himself on September the 29th, 1977, in a corner room of East Hall, the very room where those young men had seen this guy go into.
Oh, wow. You know, I think that's, you know, while you were talking, I was sitting here thinking, it seems like there's so many colleges and universities I know of that have very similar stories, and I was kind of wondering if it was a suicide, because so many of them do seem to be centered around students who killed themselves, and it's such a shame. It also reminded me of a private investigation that we've had before, where a very similar thing happened to some of our investigators over in Fort Scott, where investigating a historic home, and a couple of our team members had walked out on the porch, and they see a young man get out of a car pull up, and the driver get out, walk across the street, and then someone else get out of the driver's side and walk down towards the house, and looked up at the house and said, does Mr. Lunt still live here? And he actually had died earlier in the year, and family still owned it. And one of the investigators said, no, he's passed away, but his daughter lives here. And he said, oh, turns around, walks off, and then disappears. And ends up that the daughter recognized him by description as a neighbor kid who had died 30 years before.
Oh, my. That happens a lot. And here's a coda to that story of East Hall. Just recently, I found out what high school he went to, so I contacted them, and they sent me a photograph from the yearbook page. So I took his photo and I blew it up. And as soon as I saw it, I said, you know, that looks like the guy I followed that night. But I only caught a glimpse of the face, so I wasn't sure. So I sent it around to people who had actually witnessed this ghost, a couple who had come face-to-face to it, like James. I haven't heard from him, but I've heard from 4 different people who came face-to-face with the ghost. Oh, my God, that's him. That is definitely him. Where did you find this picture? So I'm relatively sure that we've solved the mystery of, you know, what he looked like and who he was, because I was pretty sure, and then that they are 100% sure. There's not one of them has waffled about it a bit. And so,
well, you know, I think that's a really good explanation of the value of keeping stories alive, is that the validation for people who have the experiences.
Yes.
Well,
you know, a lot of people thought they were crazy, but.
Well, yeah. Do you think it's an intelligent haunting?
Yes. It's definitely. Hold on a second, please. Sorry. What was I saying?
Oh, well,
I got interrupted and distracted.
Oh, no, I just asked if you thought it was an intelligent
haunting. I think it's an intelligent haunting. That, I think, has elements of both. I think his spirit is there, but I think some of the things they see are repetitive, like a residual, a place memory. because he doesn't seem to pay any attention to anybody when he's on his walk from the basement upstairs. It seems like he just does the same thing over and over. But other times he seems to interact with people, so I think there are elements of both there. And in other ghost stories in East Hall, it's residual, and there are some other intelligent hauntings there. In fact, there's one where I think people messing around with something they shouldn't have actually did bring something dark in there for a while.
And why don't you tell us about that?
I do believe that, well, some people messed around with a Ouija board in this one classroom. And for a while after they did that, people would talk about feeling like they were being watched, like they shouldn't be there, like there was a hostile feeling. If they turned the lights out, they felt like something was in the room with them. People would be touched, things of that nature. And after a while, that just stopped happening. I'm not sure why, but that happened after they played with that thing down there.
Well, with that in mind, what do you think of that new movie that's out, the Ouija movie that's out now?
Ouija?
Do you think that's going to cause people to use them, or do you think it'll scare them away?
I'm afraid so. I'm very afraid so. But I mean, my advice to anyone who's thinking about it is don't, because I mean, a lot of people say they're just a toy, and really, that Parker Brothers thing, it is a toy, but you can infuse it with energy. And Ouija is not an ancient term; it's not a mystical term at all. No. Ouija is just the French and the German words for yes put together, and that's what they named that board that those two guys developed and Parker Brothers took over. But talking boards have been around for centuries. But Ouija's not an old concept. But I'm afraid it's going to make people want to try it, especially young kids and teenagers. I mean, maybe even us older folks who should know better. And I'm afraid somebody's going to get hurt or get scared to death or something. It's just
and that's I think too. I agree with you. I don't really even want to support the movie in any way, shape, or form because I don't feel like that it's portraying a proper message to people. And I think it's going to stem people's curiosity in it and cause them to buy them and try to use them. And if you don't know how to use them, people, and you open up something and bring it in and you can't control, guess what?
Exactly. Yeah. It's not a plaything.
And if you don't close, if you open a doorway and you don't close it, you leave it open there, who knows what's going to come through that. So, it's best that people don't fool those things like that.
That's true. I mean,
I know that's not going to discourage anybody, but my advice is don't.
That it reminds me of the disclaimers. Don't try this at home. I mean, people who really specialize in spiritual warfare, things like that, that really deal with those kind of issues are one thing, but playing around with it's much different.
Really different.
Yeah. Well, I've often had people ask me, can I bring a Ouija board? And my answer is always, if you want it burned. Because I do not allow them near me. I don't allow them around. I don't allow them to be used in my presence. And so, if anybody wants to have one of those things on investigation with me, they might as well hang it up.
Yeah.
On that same lines, what's your thoughts on psychics and mediums on investigations?
You put me on the spot there. I'll tell you my honest opinion. I'm not big on psychics and mediums, period. When I say that, I mean these people who wear turbans and have crystal balls and wear robes and sit at the table and try to take your money. I believe people who genuinely have a gift like that are more reserved. They don't spread it out because people think they're crazy, and they're not out in it for the money. I'm very much like Harry Houdini when it comes to that. I've never met one yet that I couldn't debunk. As far as, I can tell your future, I can tell if there's this, I can tell if there's that. Now, I do believe there are people who genuinely have the gift to sense spirits. Amy, I believe, can do that to an extent. I can tell they're there. But as far as I think most of the psychics and mediums that you encounter are cold readers. They ask leading questions, like they'll say, I see a Robert, a Bob, until he says a name until he hits on one. And then he just guesses until he gets something right. And people are like, oh my God, how can you know that? Not realizing what has happened. Yeah, but there are people who
if you like the ones I've seen, there's some I've seen on TV that I question. I mean, just simply because you're right, they do ask leading questions and common names like that. I mean, anybody, you're going to hit it eventually. You know, I mean,
if you ask about Mary or John or Lisa, enough, they're common names. You know?
Now, if you ask about LaQuisha, you might get a whole nother. I mean, that's a whole nother animal. But I mean, because it's not a common name, you know. But I agree with you on that. I mean, I think there's some shysters out there.
Yeah, I mean, John and I have talked about this before. I think there are some that have real gift, and we're real cautious about using the term medium or psychic, I mean, if someone can lead the police to the dead body 2,000 miles away with nothing, then, that's a gift. That's a rare gift. I think that...
Well, I prefer the term sensitive, spiritual sensitive, because you can be sensitive to these things, but not be able to predict this or that. And it's useful to have someone who's sensitive on an investigation while you're there in real time. Because when you're doing your EVP and you're taking your pictures, you don't know until you go home and look through it if you've had anything happen. And
That's
also,
right.
if they're there and they tell you they sensed something, they felt something, and it matches up with a photograph or audio evidence that you have, I think that helps to validate what you've got.
And I'll be honest, from my own standpoint, some of the most fantastic things in the world to me was the Echo Box, because it was instant validation in a lot of cases for things that I would sense or come across. We get, quite a bit of instant validation with some of the things that I pick up or Lisa picks up.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of cool. And I agree with you. I don't even like the word psychic. I refer to myself as a psychotic large instead of a psychic medium. So,
or a sensitive, perhaps.
Oh yeah, that's better. Yeah. Sensitive, right?
At least in public company, right?
No, I'm a psychotic large in public company too.
Well, that a lot of people put a lot of stock into these orbs, the lights, and I really don't put a whole lot of stock in them. Most of them, I believe, are dust or water particles or bugs or something like that. But I'd say there's 1 in 100 that really is. There's really something to it. And like we have a photograph on our Camel City Spirit Seekers Facebook page of a heart-shaped orb in a cemetery. And I think there's something to that one, because there were things happening around the same time that photograph was taken. And the cemetery is the Browder Cemetery, where the Charlie Lawson family is buried. And there have been times where we have captured orbs in pictures, and the most recent time we were at Greensboro College doing an investigation, and I was taking some pictures, and I just got a feeling, and I said, there's a presence, and it's right there. And I pointed, and Professor Alvin Prophet, who is an associate of mine and comes with us sometimes, took a picture just as I pointed, and I pointed right dead at an orb, and it wasn't visible to the naked eye. But in the photograph, I'm pointing right at it, and it's just as I say, there's a presence, and it's right there. So when there's corroborating evidence, I kind of feel like there's something to it.
Well, we tend to be very skeptical on orbs as well, and
very skeptical.
99.999% of them are dust, pollen, moisture. In our experience, when there are what we refer to as energy orbs and usually they appear very three-dimensional. Usually they aren't round and often change shape. and very bright.
Very bright. Sometimes not white. They'll be miscolored, or not miscolored. They'll be pink or, purple or whatever. But
yeah. We've seen
almost like
red, golden, and particularly green.
Yeah.
And so many people will bring us photos, and I'm sure you too, that, it really is just dust. But, and if you tell them that, they're still convinced that it's not. But, whatever. But
yeah.
You want to pretend like it's, somebody that's fine.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that I find interesting, that people seem to cling to more than almost anything are photos of dust orbs. And I haven't really figured out why. And they get so crestfallen when you show them that you can eliminate them by using a sun filter on a camera.
Right.
But I haven't quite figured out why it's those orbs that are so fascinating and convincing to so many people.
I don't know. There's no way to know. But I guess it's something that they think is unusual, and they go with it.
Well, I think for all those people, they need to sit and watch a DVR for about 8 hours and watch dust.
Yeah, it's easy to figure it out when you see it like that. You're watching DVR and they're floating around there. It's easy to see their dust.
This is kind of
like I said. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Michael.
Like I said, I believe there's 1 in 100 that there's something to it. But most of them there's just, you can naturally, if you can recreate it, then my rule of thumb is if you can recreate it, then it's not valid.
Right. In all honesty, in my opinion, once you've seen a true orb, it's very obvious.
Yeah.
It's pretty obvious that it's out of the ordinary and not just a piece of dust or a pollen or floating around. So,
excuse me, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Yeah, I think you're right. A true orb is pretty obvious.
With your books, is there a theme to them, like from like Native American stories or Civil War stories, like based around your area, or?
Well, most of them are in my area. The first book was pretty much everything was in my area, largely family stories I heard from friends, some personal experiences, and a few well-known stories that we threw in with a new information or twist to them. And the second book has stories from one end of the state to the other, but was concentrated mostly in the Piedmont. And the third book, which I wrote with Amy, is just the triad: Winston-Salem, Greensboro, High Point, Kernersville, and the area in the middle of all that. And there's no real theme of Civil War or this or that. There's a complete variety of ghost stories in each of those books. Lydia is the most famous North Carolina ghost story. In fact, I will be appearing on the show Monsters and Mysteries in America in the spring, interviewed about the Lydia story.
Oh, cool.
We have researched that story for years ad nauseum. And I'll tell you honestly, there is no Lydia. If a girl died out there, she had a completely different name. We think that a young lady named Mary might have died out there. But the Lydia, I'm not sure where the name came from. But we accounted for every woman between 1900 and 1940 who died in Guilford County with Lydia as her first, middle, or last name. None fit.
Interesting. What are the details of the story?
Well, supposedly the girl was with her boyfriend in 1923. They had been to a dance. She was on her way home to High Point via what is now called High Point Road, Main Street in Jamestown, and then Lexington Avenue in High Point. She was on her way down through there, and just below Guilford Technical Community College, which wasn't there at the time, there was an underpass beneath a railroad track, and something happened there. It was a foggy and rainy night, and they either collided with another car or hit the actual underpass. But he was killed instantly, and she was either thrown from the car or crawled from the car and died on the side of the road. And immediately after that, people started seeing her on the side of the road. They would think it was just a girl who needed help. They would stop to pick her up, and she would ask them to take her home to High Point. And when they would get there, she wouldn't be in the car anymore.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's a standard vanishing hitchhiker story. There's one in every state at least. That's several here in North Carolina. But this one, a lot of people thought there's something to it because the name is so different. Lydia, which is usually Mary or Laura or something like that. But we researched, and it turns out that the young lady that we think died out there actually was named Mary, and we believe the song "Bringing Mary Home" is based on that story.
Oh.
But several people have claimed to pick her up over the years, but they never managed to get her home. And so we started researching that story, and I've researched that story for more than 20 years. It's in all three of the books in some form or another, and with updates from the previous books. And we could not find a Lydia. We found Lydias that died in 1923, but none of them fit. And Nancy Roberts, the greatest North Carolina ghostwriter of all time, I spoke to her in 2004, shortly before my first book, Roadside Revenants, came out. And she told me that she made the name up of the man who picked her up in 1924, who was the basis of her story in her book. The name was Burke Hardison. It's a pseudonym because the man didn't want everybody to know who he was. So she agreed to make this name up for him. And she told me that shortly before that book came out.
So, I mean, so that makes sense.
I'm sorry?
So that makes sense then why you haven't been able to document it. And I can understand someone not wanting to be associated with, a story like that, wishing to be anonymous. So,
and it started me thinking that perhaps she used a pseudonym for the girl as well. And
right.
So when I started looking into the name Mary, from 1900 to 1940, there were a few thousand Lydias. We covered them all. The same period from 1900 to 1940 with the name Mary, anybody that wants to tackle that can go right ahead. There's just too many of them. I could work the rest of my life probably and never go through all of this.
Well, yeah, I think Mary was the most popular name in America for about 70 or 80 years, so I imagine there's just a few out there.
Yeah, and that story is probably going to remain neither proven or disproven for the rest of the time, unless somebody just gets an army to go in there and look through all those names. Somebody might eventually find it. I don't know.
I'm kind of curious in your area, and your area is older than ours. We're in Missouri. Is there a certain time period that seems to have more ghost stories associated with it than others?
The Civil War really has a whole lot in this. It's because it was fought through here. It was fought largely in the South. There were maybe 2 or 3 major battles in the North. The rest were in the South. And so all those people that died, and there are all sorts of ghost stories. There's a major one about Bentonville that people will see regiments marching out on the fields down there, and they'll ask locals about it, and there are no reenactors around at the time. So, it's like they've seen ghost regiments.
We have we have the same experiences here because, and although it's not as well known west of the Mississippi, but we had intense guerrilla fighting in our area, and I'd say Civil War ghosts are probably more common than anything else. And aside just from the level of emotion and brutality associated with that war, I think that's I think that's very true for border states and southern states generally. Seems to be almost a rule of thumb. Michael, we're getting towards the end of the hour. If you would throw out the names of your books and where people can find them, and I recommend that they look them up and read them. It's important to remember these stories and to pass them along.
Okay. Well, each book does have a Facebook page of its own, and a couple of them have bonus chapters in the notes. But the first one that came out in 2005 is now in its second printing. It's called Roadside Revenant and Other North Carolina Ghosts and Legends. It's $12. It's available at most book retailers, on Amazon.com. I've seen copies on eBay, and you can order them straight from the publisher, Bright Mountain Books. The second book is Tar Heel Terrors, More North Carolina Ghosts and Legends. It's also $12 for Bright Mountain Books, and it's available in the same places. The third book is Ghosts of the Triad with my co-author, Amy Spees. It's called Ghosts of the Triad, Tales from the Haunted Heart of the Piedmont. And this one actually has photographs in it, so it's a little more expensive. And in the introduction, there's actually a picture of a ghost captured in a portrait. But it is $19.99, published by the History Press. That one is available also in Kindle and other e-readers, as well as book retailers, Amazon, and through the publisher History Press.
Very awesome.
Great having you, Michael. Appreciate it.
Yes, we really appreciate it. Hope to have you back again, and good luck with the show in the spring. And keep in touch with what's going on, and we'd love to have you back another time.
Okay, thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you.
Yeah. And everyone, stay tuned for Closer to Death with Selena Roan. She's got Minda Tate Wigand online from One True Paranormal and Branson Ghost Tours. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Good evening.
And vice versa. I tend to be I believe in a spirituality and a personal relationship with my God as far as my personal beliefs. But we have several different belief systems in our group. But yeah, I use science as a tool, and that's it.
I agree. I think in our quest, we all have that quest that we want something that's objective and verifiable, that kind of passes that muster of the scientific method. And sometimes it's easy to reject everything else as superstition, I guess.
Sure.
And forget that that there is a very valid role for folklore and storytelling independent of anything else. What do you, being a paranormal investigator or a folklorist?
Well, it started as more of the folklore, trying to preserve the stories. But as it progressed, and we began looking more into the stories and the history behind them and experiencing things ourselves, it transformed into an investigation type deal. Amy and I have a group called Camel City Spirit Seekers based out of Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And we have been around the state doing investigations and presenting programs on North Carolina ghosts. So I have had experiences. In fact, when I was 13, I remember seeing my grandpa a few days after he passed away. And that was a deeply personal experience, and I don't really talk much about that because it was so personal. But I guess you could call that my first paranormal experience.
Well, and I could, yeah, certainly. What do you think will happen as far as the role of storytelling and folklore as technology progresses?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. You faded out on me.
Okay, let me try this again. What do you think the role of folklore and story is going to, how it's going to change with progression of technology?
Well, I don't know. I hope storytelling doesn't die out, because that would be a real shame. I think maybe with CDs and everything and the podcasts on the internet, maybe storytellers will get to the point of where they're recording their stories more than actually going out in groups and telling them. But I enjoy doing that. I like to have an audience, and I can sit there and I relate these stories. And they always seem to have fun with it. So hopefully that will not die out.
I know I grew up in a house that had activity, and that was my initial interest, and then kind of came back to it much later too. But you kind of got me thinking. As investigators, we get so busy in trying to document evidence and talk about the validity of evidence and truth and reality that we can kind of forget sort of, the much longer human tradition of folklore and mythology that what do you think the value of folklore is today versus science validation?
Well, science is a really good tool, but it's not the be-all, end-all. We use scientific equipment and we use scientific methods when we're doing investigations, but we also rely on our instincts and our feelings. And a lot of times, science will fail you with your feelings. Out that there was at least one ghost story, and the rest is history, because people begin telling about their encounters with the ghosts, and that got me started looking into the stories, and we even had some experiences ourselves. But that made me start thinking about all the stories from when I was younger that I'd heard, and I began to think about all the stories that had been lost because no one's telling stories anymore, really. And so I decided to try to save what I could and preserve them in a book, and that led to 2 books of my own, one book that I've co-authored with my friend Amy Spees, and we have just started on working on a 4th.
Very awesome. Now, that's sort of a little different than a lot of people. Usually it's a haunting that they experience themselves that kind of get them started. Did you approach this more from